Order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Justice Select Committee, which is looking at prison education as part of our inquiry into rehabilitation and resettlement. Before I ask our first guests to introduce themselves, we will, as usual, do our declarations of interest, starting to my right with Tessa Munt.
Thank you. Tessa Munt, I'm the member for Wells and Mendip Hills in Somerset, and all of my declarations are on the website.
Josh Babarindi, MP for Eastbourne. I used to run a company that trained and employed ex-offenders and delivered some education services towards them. All my other interests are declared on the register.
Andy Slaughter, I'm the chair of the committee. I'm a non-practising barrister. I'm the patron of two justice-related charities, the Upper Room, for which is concerned with reoffending, and the Hammersmith Football Centre, and I'm a member of the Unite and GMB trade unions.
I'm Pam Cox. I'm the Member of Parliament for Colchester, previously Professor in Criminology, Sociology, University of Essex, and my interests are declared on the register.
Good afternoon, my name is Lindsay Farnsworth. I'm the Member of Parliament for Amber Valley. I'm a non-practising solicitor, formerly working at the Crown Prosecution Service, and my registration of interests are as on the website.
Hello, I'm Mark Sewards. I'm the MP for Leith South West and Morley, former maths teacher, and all of my interests are declared on the website.
I'm Serena Breckenridge, MP for Wolverhampton North East, guesting on today's Justice Select Committee because Mark and I are on the Education Select Committee. I'm a former deputy head teacher working in secondary schools, and all my interests are declared in the register.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Serena, for pointing out that we have two guests from the Education Select Committee as well today, which we're very pleased with. Now you know who we are, perhaps you would introduce yourselves.
Yes, shall I start? Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Annick Platt. I'm the Operations Director for Novus. So Novus is part of the LTE Group, which is a further education corporation. So we deliver prison education in just over 50 prisons and have been delivering for over 30 years.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Collins. I'm Chief Executive of the Prisoners Education Trust, and we're a charity that provides access to distance learning for people in prison.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michala Robertson. I'm Assistant Director for Student Additional Support at the Open University, and we provide higher education in over 150 prisons in the UK.
Thank you very much for coming to share your expertise with us today. Different members of the committee will ask you questions. They may be directed to individuals, but otherwise feel free to answer any of them. I'm just going to kick off with a couple of questions. In your view, what role does supporting prisoners' educational outcome have in promoting efforts towards rehabilitation?
Happy to go first on that. I mean, I think there's a pretty robust and extensive evidence base now that participating in education while you're in prison both reduces reoffending rates on release and increases the likelihood that someone who participates in education in prison will move into employment when they leave. And we know obviously that employment is important in terms of helping people not to reoffend. So I think evidence from here in England and Wales, from abroad, from our own work, I'm sure all of us, demonstrates that clear link. So we know that it has an important impact on rehabilitation. And we know that by giving people the skills and the qualifications they need, it helps them to thrive when released. But we also know that it can help with self-confidence, with engaging with the prison regime, and with their well-being, all of which can help to contribute to their rehabilitation.
And if I just come in there, with kind of 62% of the population having a literacy and numeracy need, there's an awful lot to do. So the scale of need is great. And with at the expense of sending someone to custody, it's really important that we ensure that we spend that time wisely. I've spent 30 years teaching and delivering prison education, and I've seen firsthand the power it can have and the power it can have to turn people's lives around. So I always think spending that time wisely in prison is the right thing to do. If you do nothing, nothing will change. So I think it's just about today recognising the importance and the research to show that the power of prison education, what it can achieve for rehabilitation.
If I may, I'd like to focus on higher education within prisons. Higher education is a really powerful tool for change. It has a tool to empower people into employment, and it reduces reoffending. So statistics from the Ministry of Justice Data Lab show that within 12 months of release, students who have been studying with the Open University are 28% more likely to be in employment. There is a 40% reduction in reoffending within the first 12 months of release for students at the OU, and the Longford Trust, who support students on undergraduate degrees, shows that less than 5% of the recipients of their trust reoffend.
What percentage of prisoners undertake higher education?
We offer it in every one of the 150 prisons in England and Wales.
Of just under 90,000 prisoners, how many of those will be undertaking higher education?
We have 2,000 students every year, every academic year, who are studying in prison.
Do you think that's a good level, or do you think there's potential there?
I think there's potential to increase that. There are many barriers to funding and learning within prisons for higher education, and I think if those barriers were removed, we would see greater numbers.
I was going to ask one other general question. I think, Tessa, you want to come in, but we're obviously going to focus a lot on what the education offer is, but two things struck us. One is that there are so many barriers to prisoners, sometimes physical barriers, actually reaching education.
Yes.
Because they're locked in their cell, because it's not available for some reason, yeah, for one reason or another, because there are staffing problems elsewhere in the prison. And also there have been a series of attempts to modify the offer on that over time. So I think, frankly, it's very difficult to be clear. You might be clear, but I think it's probably from the outside observer clear what's happening. So can you just give us a picture of how difficult it is to educate prisoners at the moment? And they're presumably not, are they a cohort of people who are welcoming education, who you're pushing at an open door, or have you in addition got these problems, probably the wrong phrase, open door, or have you additionally got problems that there simply are not the funding, the staffing, the facilities to do it?
I think the interest and the drive to succeed in higher education is definitely there. Our OU students are a testament to hard work, perseverance, and a deep personal commitment to growth. There are barriers for somebody who wants to apply to the OU. So in order to be eligible to apply for a higher education degree with the OU, prisoners need to have completed their level 1 and level 2 literacy and numeracy. I have students who have shared that because of inaccurate record keeping, they have repeatedly have to do level 1 and level 2, in one case 18 times. And because there wasn't the proof that they had completed level 1 and level 2 literacy and numeracy, they weren't able to apply for the OU. There is also the 6-year rule for funding, so prisoners can't apply for a student loan until 6 years or less from release. And I don't think that higher education level learning is given the focus that it needs to, that core education is within prison. We deliver it via distance and online learning methods, and so there are always the technological barriers within prison. And the last thing is that higher level education is not part of purposeful activity, whether in cell or in a classroom. There are pockets of really good practice where there are even open university and distance learning wings and classroom facilities, ICT suites made available to OU learners. But it's not consistent, it's certainly not constant, and it's not given the priority that higher level education should.
I think equally on the other end of the scale, so for learners who require that lower level provision, so who maybe non-readers at all or scoring a kind of level 2 or below, which I said is around 67%, there's equal challenges there to access education. We've got to remember about over 40% of them have been excluded from the kind of school environment prior to coming to custody, and often adult learners. So the thought of engaging in a maths or English class in a classroom environment is probably the very last thing they want to do in a prison. So we also have those complexities and challenges, and it's about how we hook and engage people into that learning offer. We're very confident that when we get them, we keep them. Our kind of retention rate's up in the 90%, but we've got to get them first. On top of all the complexities you talk about with the kind of officer shortages, the issues with movements, just physically getting people from A to B can be a challenge and can be complex. And sometimes the environment that they come to is difficult. You talked about, is funding an issue? I don't think the prison-built environment and some of the educational learning areas have been invested in for probably, well, in the 30 years that I've been working there. And I think we need an environment and a built environment that's fit for a curriculum of the 21st century as well. So, and then also about the level of funding. The level of funding for prison education is 17% lower than that of the community, but the need is greater, 4 times higher in prison education than that of the community. So there's just a misalignment there that probably needs levelling up at some point. So the challenge of actually meeting need, you talk about the number of people in prison and those high level of need, there's a real challenge there with funding as well as all the other complexities.
Well, thanks.
Do you mind?
No.
I might be trampling over something that I know Andy wanted to ask, but you said 62% of prisoners have literacy and numeracy needs. When does that get measured?
Okay.
How does that get measured?
So when a prisoner comes into custody, they go through a resettlement and a kind of induction process. Part of the induction process is an education and learning and skills assessment completed by the education provider. So it's alongside other prison induction. They might be doing induction for drug and substance and housing and other things. But we come in during usually that first 5 days in custody. Not always ideal if people are, suffering some kind of substance misuse. It's not always ideal timing. But we come in during that time and we'll do a national screening test that looks at literacy, numeracy, reading, and will provide levels. That's all then recorded on the national prison system, hopefully to stop repeat testing, because prisoners move from A to B and then suddenly we throw another test at them. Again, it's not the best thing that we want to do when we're trying to hook them into learning. So it's all recorded, it's all there, and it's all measured. And after that score, we then develop a personal learning plan with them, a learning development plan with them that's personalised to them, their sentence length, how long they're going to be with us, what their needs are, their rehabilitation requirements, and it's a personal plan that they then follow.
Thank you. Are there courses that they cannot take? I think there are, aren't there? That might be a question actually for Michala. It may be, but I understand there are courses that prisoners may not study. What are those?
So you would not be able to study anything of level 3 and above. So the courses that Prisoners Education Trust and the Open University offer, so A level and above. So none of our access courses. And the Open University is exactly that, open. We have an open entry policy, which means you don't need prior qualifications to study towards a degree. We will encourage you to enrol in one of our access courses. And it's interesting that the government itself is moving away from the necessity and the mandatory level 1 and level 2 qualifications in areas such as apprenticeships. And this is what we have been doing at the Open University for many years. But with our students in prison, they have that as a sanction, that they are not allowed to apply for anything above level 2 if they don't have recorded level 1 and level 2 literacy and numeracy.
Can I just come in on that? So the courses that we offer, so Prisoners Education Trust, we offer access to a range of distance learning courses, including, as Michala mentioned, GCSEs and A-levels, also Open University access courses, but a whole range of vocational courses, bookkeeping, business startup, whatever. We offer about 130 courses altogether, so a really broad range with the idea there's something there for anyone. But people are required to have done level 2 in literacy before they're able to access one of those courses. And we know that relatively few people, about 7% last year of people arrive in prison with level 2 already, and relatively small numbers progress to level 2 each year through the core education provision. So there's sort of a pipeline issue of if people can't complete level 2, they then can't move on to a range of broader qualifications that essentially aren't available to them until they've either demonstrated they're already at level 2 or they achieve level 2. So for us, we already have, you asked before about people who are interested in studying and whether people want to do education. We already have more people applying to us than we're able to support because of funding restrictions. But nonetheless, we feel there's a lot more people out there who'd be interested in what we have to offer, but they have to move through to level 2 in the core education system first, already be at level 2 before they can apply to us.
I'm particularly interested. I might have not been very clear. Are there any subject? Can a prisoner study law and become eventually a solicitor or a barrister?
So the core education offer, and Annick would be a better place to speak to this than me, wouldn't obviously include law. It focuses on literacy, numeracy, vocational courses, a number of other things. But they could, if they'd achieved level 2 in literacy, they could come to us and study a GCSE or an A-level, an OU access course, and then go through and study with the OU, and that could include law and a whole range of other, the OU's broad offer of degrees. We offer A-levels in as many subjects as we can. So there are those opportunities to study a broad range of courses, and we try and remove as many restrictions as possible. There may be some restrictions around particular offence types and then particular courses people do, but generally speaking, we try and make it as open as possible.
So would it be possible that one of you, I don't want to get us bogged down in this, but I'm pretty clear, having dealt with one particular prisoner, that he was absolutely forbidden from studying law, even though he had 5 A levels way before he got to prison. So I would really be interested in knowing, I'd ask you to write to the chair of the committee to just explain where one may not study if you are at His Majesty's pleasure.
I think that's really a question for the prison service because they make those decisions, but I'm happy to set out the guidance as we understand it, but it might be something to refer to HMPPS.
Can I ask one other tiny... go on. I want to understand how long it takes. You talked about a personal plan.
Yes.
Does the prisoner carry that, or is that held by the prison? Because I'm aware that sometimes when prisoners are moved, which is sometimes very frequently, it takes months for their plans to pick up with them, and they sometimes have moved again by the time the plan gets to prison B, they're already in prison C, and their education is completely disrupted by the inability. You were talking about everything being online, everybody gets it all digitalised. It's clearly not talking one prison to another, or even prison to centre to prison. Am I right?
You are right, but it is becoming more digitalised. So there is something called a digital IOP now that's being developed. So that will be an online learning plan that will be developed once and then passed throughout their sentence and accessible to different providers dependent on where the prisoner goes. So yes, you're right, that's what we've experienced in the past, that prisoners have been retested or had to start the journey again, which is just not conducive to their learning experience. But we are moving towards a digitalised service that's part of the prison service system. It's not a provider system, it's a prison service-wide system.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think Tess has already teased out quite a lot of the information that I was going to ask about, because I wanted to ask you about the level of need across prisons. And of course, Annick, you've already set out what the percentages are for the prisons that you work with. So my question would be then to John and Michala, does that match up with what you think the level of need is across prisons? And then to Annick and to all three of you, what about neurodivergent needs? Are those a particular problem in prisons, and what are the percentages there? So starting with, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, the assessments that Annick mentioned are then collated and published as statistics by the Ministry of Justice. So we know quite a lot about the levels of people entering prison. Obviously, there's less information about people who are already in prison, so you don't necessarily have a picture of the prison population as a whole, but you do know the levels that people are at when they enter. Annick's already talked about the proportion of people who are at entry level 2 or below, but I think the other group that it's worth bearing in mind is that within that, there's quite a substantial number of people, so about 1 in 5 of the people who arrive in prison every year, who for literacy are at entry level 1 or below, which as a former teacher you'll probably know is roughly what you'd expect in a child at sort of age 5 to 6. It's slightly different in adult literacy levels, but it's very low levels of literacy. And in those circumstances, it's obviously going to be difficult for them to engage with the prison regime and to participate fully in any educational activities in a classroom. So I think it's really important to recognise that while there is a very high level of need across most of the prison population and a very small proportion who are at level 2, so roughly GCSE level, even within that there are a cohort who have very low levels of literacy. I think that's why Ofsted and the Prisons Inspectorate have been right to really focus on reading and on those with those low levels of literacy to try and get them up to a level where they can engage with the regime more broadly. Obviously the cohort that we're working with directly as an organisation are those who are, as I mentioned, who are at level 2 or higher, and they are a minority in the prison population. We fund about 1,600 courses per year, and there's more than enough people applying to us, as I said, so we've got more demand than we can meet as a charity at this moment in time. So it's a minority in the prison population, but it's a cohort who are keen to learn, who are keen to engage the courses that we offer, and who are keen to do the best they can to turn their lives around and have more opportunities when they leave prison. So I think that it's really important to see that bigger group of people with high levels of need, but it's important not to lose sight of those people who are at higher levels who want to continue to progress and try and make sure we give them the opportunities to do that both when they're in prison and when they leave.
Thank you.
So if I can speak to the neurodiverse needs.
Yes, please.
There are statistics to show that the prison population is about 80% of prisoners have SPLDD or neurodiverse needs. The OUs is a very tailored and bespoke, individualised offer of learning, and so accessibility is at the heart of all of our materials, but in addition we provide reasonable adjustments and alternative formats for OU students studying with us, such as coloured overlays, large print, braille, digital audio. One of the things we are working on is, and we're working with a company called Coracle Inside, is providing every OU student with a secure laptop, a mobile device that is gifted to them for the duration of their study. And within that, we can then use assistive software and technology to assist with neurodiverse needs.
Very good, thank you. And finally, Annick.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do see very, very high levels in custody, as you would expect. And again, for managing that from a learning perspective is very difficult within the classroom. Over half of your classroom learners will have some kind of neurodiversity need that you will have to support within that learning cohort, which is a challenge in itself. We also find that we've got the new neurodiversity leads in prison, in custody, that are being introduced to work across the prison wide to ensure that those with a need can engage in learning, because sometimes they're the hardest to reach or don't want to engage in learning as well. But, you know, like Michala says, we have a range of technologies that we will use to support where we can, some digital technologies or some teaching technologies that we will use to support need where possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Could I just ask a supplementary to that, which is, do you have, does your the service that you offer adapt according to the cohort you're dealing with? So, for example, with female prisoners, do you do work with remand prisoners, or if they're, I know they're not obliged to, but if they want to, with IPP prisoners, how much do you tailor the service you operate to who you're dealing with?
We tailor it all because, as I talked before about that individual learning plan, it is really individualised to their specific needs. So we work across the board with all cohorts of learners, whether it's PICOSO, IOP, whether it's female, remand, sentence, lifers, across the board, young offenders, and we do have to tailor the curriculum offer to meet that particular need. The women's estate is particular, difficult, very complex, high-level needs. We talk about neurodiversity, but you're adding on some real extreme complexities with self-harm, domestic abuse, sexual abuse as well, on top of any kind of LDD need as well. So we have a more trauma-informed approach to our delivery in those sectors, because those women are often very kind of hardest away from learning, so we will adapt our learning style. So where possible and where in the environment, we will adapt our learning style to meet different cohorts.
Anything to that?
I mean, so we offer a broad range of courses, and so what we try and do is, if there's interest in doing a particular course and we're able to provide a course that can be completed in prison, with most of our courses are completed on paper because of limited digital access. If we can do that, we'll make that course available. So we try and tailor it to the individual needs. We have different levels, so people can progress through several levels in a similar topic or related area. So we try and individualise it to what people might want to apply to, and we're available across all prisons in England and Wales.
Does that include remand prisoners?
At the moment, remand prisoners aren't able to apply for our courses, so we are only available to sentenced prisoners. But then any sentence length and any type of sentence. You asked about female offenders, so we actually get a higher proportion of people in women's prisons applying to us than you'd expect based on their proportion of the population. So we see more female learners in our cohort than you'd expect based on the makeup of the prison population.
Do you want to add anything?
Yes, we find similar to John that remand prisoners aren't even encouraged into education, whatever form it is.
Are they, if they wish to? The reason I ask is that we know 1 in 5 prisoners is a remand prisoner. They're there for longer periods of time, and that may be the entire time of their incarceration if they're released on sentence or by not being convicted. So do you not feel that you're missing a whole cohort?
Absolutely we do. Yes, I think it's 20% of prisoners are on remand at the moment, and that's the 20% we'd be very interested to support. Because our learning is online and distance, it's flexible, so it can continue if they are released and found not guilty, and likewise it can continue if the other alternative occurs. With the female estate, there is, I think, 4% of the prison population is female. 5.8% of OU students in prison are female, so we seem to be matching the kind of prison picture. We have fewer numbers of under 21s, and only 2.5% of our OU students are under 21, and we have no students who are under 20, so that is an area we'd really like to work with more.
You've covered it, Chair, thank you.
Well, there you go. Serena.
Okay, thank you. So listening to some of the experiences that you've shared, what would you share as the key barriers to provision and take-up of education across the prison estate? Can we start with Annick, please?
Okay. So I talked about some of the barriers before about that whole attendance issue. So across our 43 adult estates, we've got an attendance rate of about 69%. So if you had a class of 10 learners, we've got on average 7 learners turning up to each session, which critically for me is 3 learners missing out on learning every session, every day in every prison. And when we talk about funding being restricted, it's such a shame that we haven't got those places filled. So the barriers are very much about the attendance to ensure that those prisoners come. There's also barriers, as I talked about, the learning environment and the curriculum offer to make sure the curriculum's fit for purpose and it's engaging, it's the right type of curriculum offer. The labour market needs are changing and evolving. We need to ensure our curriculum offer is ready for the next set of labour market kind of needs and requirement. And there's also some of the practical barriers for prisoners, such as, you get paid to go to work in a prison. Unfortunately, education is one of the lowest paid activities, but probably one of the activities that is known and proven to make such an impact to reducing reoffending. So there's some of the practical barriers that we face there as well.
Okay, do you find that prison capacity?
Yes, so there's obviously with the overcrowding and prison capacity at the moment, high levels of numbers, high levels of need for us, and about prioritising who gets education. There isn't enough funding to support even those who have the very basic level of need. There isn't enough provision to support just those learners. So the complexities about when we do that scale of need and then you're suddenly having to think who are we prioritising here for education, because there's only a certain amount of provision. So that is a big need. We've also found with the overcrowding as well, the early release scheme that we saw towards the end of last year, where suddenly large cohorts of offenders were released early. Some of those learners were midway through course and literally at short notice were, quick, you're off. So we got as much notice as we could, and we tried to have partnership through the gate and with community provision to ensure that they could continue learning. But that's challenges at the moment. There's a lot of high churn because prisoners are moving around the system at a much higher rate.
Okay, and John?
I'd agree that with everything that Annick has said. To add to it, a major barrier for us, and I think for other learning providers, is the lack of access to digital devices, so laptops or iPads and the internet for most people in prison. So we offer access to distance learning. Almost all distance learning in the community is now done online, but almost all of our offer in prison is still done on paper because people don't have reliable and consistent access to a computer and to the internet. And there is obviously secure ways of enabling people to access the internet in a way that ensures security but gives them learning opportunities. But for most people, that's not routinely available. So that's a major barrier in terms of both the breadth of what we can provide and it increases the cost having to provide it on paper, and it potentially makes the learning experience less positive. So lack of access to digital devices and the internet is a real challenge. And then, as Annick said, the lack of access to education departments routinely where prisons are overcrowded and there are staffing shortages, the lack of access to good quality education facilities, and something that our learners say increasingly is not being able to get routine access to libraries either, which should be something that happens routinely but doesn't always. So there's a number of sort of broader issues, and I think our experience has been that the more a prison is struggling as a prison in terms of overcrowding and struggling to provide a good quality regime, the more difficult it will be for people to access education, and the more difficult it will be for them to have a positive learning experience. And one thing that we will be looking out for over the next couple of years is that we know that as the population starts to go up again, they're looking to add more temporary cells and more accommodation to existing prisons. It will be really important to ensure that the capacity of education departments, workshops, other opportunities for people to learn grow alongside that, so you don't have more people in prison but fewer opportunities for them to access the things that we know will actually help them not to reoffend when they're released.
Michala?
Thank you. I agree with John and Annick, but for me, for higher education, the biggest barrier is that we're not considered purposeful activity within prisons. The average OU learner spends 10 hours a week studying. Whether that's done in cell, in a library or in a classroom environment, that's a really valuable use of time. And for governors in prisons, that helps form their KPIs for purposeful activity. That's the biggest barrier, and that's the thing that I think would release more change for higher education in prisons.
Okay, and if I could just ask a supplementary, if that's okay, Chair. In terms of needs, we can see, I know from my former experience about the rising demands and the complexities that young people in particular are experiencing. And you spoke about the identification of needs and an assessment that's done quite early on in the journey. How confident are you that prisoners' needs are actually identified and supported? I attended an event this morning, Jamie Oliver was in, great platform, raising awareness of a huge proportion of young people facing challenges with dyslexia, something like 10-15% of a class, but they represent 50% of the prison population. So what support is available for young people that are unidentified or misdiagnosed? Annick, if I can start with you.
So yes, there is support, but it's about how and when that support can be accessed. So we talked before about the remand population, which of course some of the young offenders will be on remand as well, and the high churn. Sometimes the length of time in custody or in that one particular prison is so short that our ability to do something longer term or even diagnose correctly, we can do the quick intervention to get a literacy and numeracy assessment or a reading assessment quite quickly, but to do something more in depth about an LDD need requires a longer period of time. So sometimes we have done the diagnosis but we don't yet then have time to deliver the intervention. There is support available for young people. In the young people's estate, we have higher levels of Senko workers and support and progression coaches who work alongside, a bit like a TA in a school. They work alongside our teachers to ensure that we can support with some of those additional learning needs. But it is very complex about how long we've got them, whether they're going to be moved around the prison or even just moved around the prison or moved around the prison estate, and about how successful we can be with that intervention. So it's challenging.
And I mean, just to add on the children's estate specifically, I mean, recent reports by both the Children's Commissioner and Ofsted and the Prisons Inspectorate have expressed quite serious concern about access to and quality of education in the children's estates, in YOIs particularly, and clearly it is a very challenging cohort that are being worked with, and they do need a lot of support. So I think both in the children's estate and in the adults' estate, we are improving the screening and the gathering of information and the recording of that information has already been mentioned. I mean, that's really important, and that's a good thing, though. I would say that I know this better from the adult estate, sometimes doing an assessment very early after people have arrived in prison. Well, it's important to find out quickly what's going on and where they're going to. You may not be getting a full picture because people are very discombobulated, obviously having just arrived in custody, and may not be giving you a full picture of both their levels and their needs. So I think it is important. Well, it's important to do those assessments. What you want is a relationship over time between staff and learner so that people get to genuinely understand their need and are able to personalise what's offered to them. And the reality is that's very difficult to do in a prison system where there's overcrowding, under-resourcing and high levels of churn. So I think it's difficult to say that the specific needs of all the learners in prison are getting met. You don't see that from Ofsted reports. You don't see that from other assessments that are done. And it's not a failure by sort of individuals. It's a much broader system problem in terms of the pressure the prison system is under and the difficulties of providing a really personalised, learner-focused offer in those circumstances where you might get to do a couple of weeks of work with someone in a class, and then the next 2 weeks they're one of the 3 out of 10 that it isn't brought to you that day, and it's all disrupted. So overall, I think we need to make sure that the education offer is more personalised and more learner-centred, but particularly for those with higher levels of need. It's making sure that there's a relationship with them so you get a full picture of that need and don't overly rely on the sort of initial assessment, which may not give you that full picture.
Can I just pick up one other point? Because I think when talking about children, one thing we shouldn't really be doing is retesting. If a child's been involved in education in the community, there's a wealth of information there. They might be on an education, health and care plan. And I think we need better links with local authorities to ensure that actually we continue that learner journey. We shouldn't be starting from scratch again with a child who's been engaged previously. We should have a seamless approach and we should pick up and mirror. So we do need to develop better links. We find it's good in some areas, but patchy in others.
And that's going both ways. That's coming into custody, but also for people leaving custody as well, so that we can make sure their needs are picked up in the community, particularly if, as Annick was mentioning, people have done part of a qualification or started a course or have done something, making sure they have the opportunity and the support to complete that. Because there's nothing more frustrating than starting something if you're committed to it and not being able to finish it.
Nothing more to add.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Lindsay, do you know?
No, it's fine. It's been covered.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you very much. In that case, we will go to Tessa.
Do you want to move on because I'll come back?
Okay.
Could I cover 6, the funding area?
Yeah, no.
I think we covered that, did we? Hi there, I'm Pam Cox, as I said earlier, and thanks for coming in today. Just wanted to pick up on the question of funding and how much, the extent to which that's a barrier to you in providing education in prisons.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned several times today that, we are underfunding. We're not meeting the level of need that you see in the community. So funding is a barrier, especially when we do all the initial assessment and we need to provide that opportunity. We just don't have the resource available to meet the need. John mentioned before about diversifying our offer to more digital, and I think that's where we're starting to go in the future. That we've got a limited amount of resource where we have teachers that are face-to-face in classroom with learners. That should be for the more learners with the highest need, who need that one-to-one support or small cohort group learning. But we could then provide a wider digital offer for learners who could do some in-cell activity, so we can actually meet need to greater numbers of learners, but still with the same amount of funding. So that's the kind of development that we're going with now.
And could I just ask for clarity, what is the value of the Novus contract currently?
The value of the Novus contract, we have about 80 million we have across our sites, which is across all provisions, young people, Wales, everything, private sector.
And some of our visits to prisons, those of us who are on the committee more permanently, have been to several prisons, and we've heard that workshops don't run, education sessions don't run. So although you highlighted absenteeism or attendance issues within the sessions that do run, I'm also interested to press you on why sessions don't run when there's an 80 million contract behind some of that.
Our vacancy rate at the moment is less than 5%. We've done some significant work over the past 2 years on our vacancy issues following COVID. I think lots of people struggled with vacancies. We have re-evaluated our kind of terms and conditions for teachers to ensure that we attract people to prison education, and we maintain some good talent in prison education. So we do have a vacancy rate now less than 5%. We have a delivery rate over 95%, which is the contract. So in most of our sites, we are hitting our service level agreement with the prison service. So we have to deliver more than 95%. There's a 5% tolerance. So on the whole, across our sector, we are at a stage now, we haven't been years previously, but we're at a consistent stage now where we're meeting those service levels. There are gaps. We do find you have unexpected long-term sickness for some specialist courses that are kind of hard to recruit to quickly and then get people through security clearance. We can't rely on teacher banks or teacher pools in the community where you can just quickly drop people in. So we do over-resource and have a good pool of colleagues. So it has been a problem, but we're quite pleased that now we are seeing a more consistent level.
And what are those specialist courses where you've got vacancies?
Construction is often difficult, so we're trying to find someone with a trade experience and a knowledge experience, but also a qualified teacher. It's hard to find your, fully qualified paint and decorator who's also a fully qualified teacher. So we're doing a lot to work about how we grow our own and upskill and bring people in with trade experience and then deliver the qualifications ourselves to ensure that they become qualified teachers. So construction's always difficult to do. Some of our geographical areas like London is always challenging. Perhaps as some of our learning support progression people, the TA equivalents, there's high churn there. We find we hook them in, we engage them and then they move them on. So we've got geographical issues and then curriculum issues as well.
I'll push that a little bit further. We went to Buckley Hall and we visited a fantastic textile workshop, which was empty. And one of the reasons it was suggested to us why there was a lower uptake on the courses offered there was because there wasn't an accredited qualification attached to it. So I know that there's, in other prisons, they offer an NVQ certificate in manufacturing textiles and sewn products, for example. And Novus weren't offering that in that example. Talk us through why that couldn't be offered in a place like that.
So we deliver at Buckley Hall. We don't deliver the textile workshop. That's part of prison industries. That's a separate contract and delivered by prison service colleagues. So that's delivered by instructional officers directly. Where funding allows, we can, if commissioned, the prison service commission our services. If they commission us to go in and deliver those qualifications, we provide that offer, and we do in other areas. What you've probably found at Buckley Hall is that there's a limited amount of provision. That provision is being commissioned to those who need it, level 2 and below, and there isn't enough funding from the education contract to provide that wider offer in the textile industries to enhance qualifications. Usually the prison service and prison industry deliver their own qualifications, so the instructors will deliver their own qualifications.
There's a whole raft of qualifications, aren't there, in gym instructing, personal fitness, sports coaching, which are being offered in really limited numbers, which could be really transformative.
Yeah, we'd love to do it all, but there's a question of, there's a limited resources, and sometimes it's those difficult conversations. But the prison service commission that service, so they do the annual delivery plan for each prison. They do the learner needs assessment. They write the learning plan, and they give us the learning plan, and then we deliver what they commission. So we can be flexible, but when you've got limited resources, it's those hard conversations you have to have about which need you support.
I think it's just worth adding on that. I mean, volume isn't everything, because it's obviously important that there's good quality courses and good quality qualifications, but we know that many fewer courses in total are completed year on year now than they were a decade or so ago, and resourcing is a huge part of that. There hasn't been increases in prison education funding. Our understanding is the new contracts, when they roll out later this year, will probably be even leaner, and the money will only go so far. And when you're dealing with a cohort with very high levels of need, you do have to make very difficult decisions, I think. And everyone would like to offer something for everyone across every prison, but the resource simply isn't there. And I think you had a prison governor talking to your drugs around your drugs in prison inquiry, who mentioned that the money just wasn't available to make all the things available she wanted in her prison. And that's if you travel around the country visiting prisons, that's a pretty common message, that they know what the need is, they know what they'd like to do. Money isn't endless, of course it isn't, but there's just not quite enough resource to do all the things you'd like to do to provide the best opportunities for all the people who you're working with. So choices have to be made.
Indeed.
I could just come in here on the point. It sounds a bit like a prison postcode lottery in terms of different prisons that offer different types of courses, which is great. But obviously you may have a prisoner who really is drawn to construction, off the top of my head, and one prison offers that and the prison that he happens to go to doesn't. Are there any solutions or ideas of how that could be addressed? For example, could they apply for a move to a different prison, or is that just not something that would be surmountable?
That potentially could happen. It doesn't at the moment. It does through the offender behaviour programmes. So if particular offenders need to do certain offender behaviour programmes, they are moved to prison to access that resource, maybe for a period of time, and then move back to their prison in their local area. We don't do that from an education point of view, but that would be a great opportunity to have centres of excellence for construction or hubs or digital. I think also the ability to think differently with digital. So we're now trying to think about our use for kind of virtual reality. So we have in 4 of our prisons at the moment 10-star machines, which is a virtual reality construction program where you can learn to be a forklift truck driver, or you do your HGV, which is all on a simulator. And we've now got portable ones that we can take around the prison. So actually we can take courses and curriculum to other prisons. It's not always, it's quite cheap, but you can be more mobile with that. So I think a bit of a hybrid of both. But yes, the idea, we've always thought of those centres of excellence and prisons moving where the curriculum need was, a bit like you see in FEs and colleges as well.
The only thing to add to that, I think, is that in some, particularly in the open estate, there's the potential to make use of release on temporary licence for people to go out of prison during the day to study particular things that might not be available in their prison, whether that's FE or in some cases at universities. There's real potential for that. I think it's used a lot less frequently than it could be, but there are examples of where you've got partnerships between prisons and local colleges where the college comes in and offers things, but also people, if it's appropriate in terms of risk assessment, are able to go out and study particular things, and that broadens the offer.
Yeah, and I think we've heard from previous sessions that temporary release has reduced, particularly since COVID, never really recovered from that. So you'd like to see more use of that for educational purposes, would you? Yeah,
and it's mostly used at the moment for work, and that can be appropriate for a lot of people, but it can be used for education and training as well. And at the moment it's used very rarely, and as you say, less than it used to be pre-COVID. So I think there's more potential to do that. It does. Yeah, there's some challenges for prisons in making it happen, but where they can do that, it just opens up other opportunities that wouldn't necessarily be available within a prison, particularly for people who are nearing release and may need particular qualifications or particular skills to move into a job when they leave.
Thank you.
Can I go back to the funding barrier question, please?
You may. I'm just conscious of time, and we're going to have to speed up a little bit, but let's...
I'm going to talk about contracts, and we could come in there, couldn't it? In a minute.
We're going to go on to contracts in a minute. If you could hold that thought.
Well.
Tessa.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about the 6-year rule, if I may. So the previous Education Select Committee recommended the lifting of that 6-year rule. Can I have your opinion on that? I think probably particularly you, Michala.
Yes.
Go on then.
It's a nice segue because that was the funding barrier that I was going to mention.
Yes.
I think prisons really struggle with education for longer serving prisoners, longer terms. The 6-year rule could really support education for longer term prisoners. And I have some statistics here on the value in removing that 6-year rule. So the MOJ report that the annual cost per prisoner in England and Wales was £37,543 in 2017-18. If the 6-year ruling came to an end, the OU estimate of the upfront cost of student loans for an extra 200 OU entrants is 2.3 million. But that is set against a potential saving to the public purse that could be nearly 3 times that, even if loans were never repaid. For 200 OU student entrants gained, the estimated savings could be between £3 and £6 million, again, even if the student loan is never repaid. I think the benefit to longer-term prisoners in studying with the OU is the skills and behaviours and attributes they develop through studying with the OU can be of real benefit to the prison community. Many of our students take on roles in additional support, such as counsellors for the Listeners Scheme, toe-by-toe mentors for the Reading and Literacy Scheme, education orderlies, OU ambassadors, library orderlies, and I think there's real value to higher education level study for longer term serving prisoners.
So might I assume that all 3 of you would want the lifting of that 6-year rule? Thank you.
We agree with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
There's a question around technology and prison education. In short, do you think it's being used to its full extent? It can be a yes or no answer.
I'll start there.
Yeah.
The technology in prisons is currently going through a transformation from the providers over to the prison service. So the prison service now will take responsibility for all the digital infrastructure for the learning and skills offer as part of the digital education programme. So that's now being rolled out across every prison. Hopefully it will be done by the end of September. I think they've done about 30 so prisons at the moment. So that infrastructure's there, but I think there's a real need to invest more in that, not basic digital, but that ability to do something different, to talk about that kind of virtual reality. You know, we're even talking to some of the private sectors about the virtual reality headset. So, you know, you can actually you can be on a construction site or in a hairdressing salon or in a theatre or wherever, and you can start to learn the basic techniques. So I think there needs to be more. There's much more that needs to happen.
We're not currently delivering to the potential that we could. Is that what you're saying? We're not currently delivering.
No, we're not currently.
Right.
No, there's so much.
So I'm looking at your website, which says, by providing access to cutting-edge technology and training, we're providing prisoners with essential digital literacy skills, boosting confidence. Yes. I mean, how realistic is that actually? I mean, it's not the picture we've seen.
Well,
on our
I hope.
visits.
The technology that we have at the moment is good. So the packages that we have, like I say, it's moving from one to the other. Where we do have technology in classrooms, the technology that they can access through our platform is good. Teachers report that it's good. We've got some good use of technology. We've got some good use of AI to support teaching and learning. So yes, it is, but there's not enough of it. So you won't see it everywhere. You won't see it in all the, I'm sure when you went around Buckley Hall and some of the vocational areas, we could have a different kind of mix of IT digital solution alongside the construction, so it's limited at the moment.
I think you said you're in 43 prisons. Is that
for the PEF contract?
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So how many of those would have digital facilities like
all
that?
of them. All of them, and they've all been refreshed as well. But we're in the process of being moved over from our solution to the prison service. So all of them will have digital. Yeah.
In fact, just bringing the OU in, because I know you're online learners by par excellence. So you've managed to crack that model in prison. What is the challenge for scaling that up to allow access to non-networked devices, for tablets for prisoners, to allow them to have self-learning modules, books online, all these things? What are the barriers there?
Okay, so as you've alluded to, we have what's called the OU Ward Garden or the OU Prison Virtual Learning Environment, which is hosted on the Virtual Campus and Virtual Campus 2. So that's one of the first kind of inroads for us with digital tech within prisons. And the work that we are doing with various digital tech providers around the UK, such as Coracle Inside with our Chromebook mobile devices. The challenge is the prison infrastructure and that willingness to kind of be, that lack of willingness to be innovative. We often get that because prisons are Victorian, we're unable to provide Wi-Fi. But when you consider that you can get Wi-Fi in Parliament and even on the Underground on my journey here today, I don't think that's impossible. The challenge for us is getting through those prison walls metaphorically and practically. In the last Education Select Committee in 2021, I spoke about there being a lack of a joined-up approach for digital tech and digital education in the Prison Service and Ministry of Justice, and that there is no one clear strategy. For the OU to be able to offer all of the digital and VLE options that we do, we have to source out individual providers who are working with the Ministry of Justice and individual prisons. So there's not one clear way of working and not one clear strategy, and that would enormously help us.
Yes, that brings us to contracts. So could you talk us through the contracting framework for education services in prison, broadly speaking?
Yeah, you probably want to start with Annick on the core education.
Thanks, Annick, thanks.
So prison education is often kind of recontracted every 5 years or so. In my 30 years, I've seen the start of the Offender Learning and Skills Service, 1, 2, 3 and 4, and then move into PEF and then now into PES. So every 5 to 7 years is a whole recontracting approach where it's either the Ministry of Justice or in the past it's been through the DFE and the Skills Funding Agency procured that service. It's been split up differently at every new contract has a different term, whether it's geographically or kind of curriculum based. At the moment we're in something called LOTS, so the new prison education service that we're right in the middle of a live procurement, so I can't talk too much detail about it, has 11 geographical lots available and £98 million worth for 98 English prisons. So that's currently what's being procured. That's got a contract length for 4 years with the option to extend for another 3 years dependent on contract performance. So I think for our colleagues and for colleagues who teach in prison education, they are going through a potential TUPA situation every 5 to 7 years, which is quite disruptive and quite difficult when we're trying to attract and keep prison education expertise, that you could be subject to TUPE every 5 to 7 years. And I also think from a provider point of view, there's also not as much incentive to invest in the provision. And if we had a longer contract like we do with the Prison Education Transformation Programme, where they contract out prisons, they're on a 20 or 25-year contract. So you've got some really longevity of service to significantly invest in a new infrastructure, a new digital solution, and you're not constantly changing every 5 to 7 years. So that's the way it currently happens.
Thank you for the overview. And there are 4 major providers, I believe. Yeah. So Novus, yourselves, People Plus, Western College and Milton Keynes College, yes, on the routine education. What are relations like between the 4 of you? Do you collaborate? Do you innovate together?
We do. So in particular, probably that's really been strengthened since COVID. So following COVID, we had weekly meetings with all 4 providers, and we've maintained those meetings on a regular basis. So I meet with colleagues who do a similar operational role to me in the other 4 providers. It always gets difficult around kind of procurement time, you know, about who's going for different lots, but the collaboration is there. So in particular on some of our curriculum development areas or our quality initiatives as well. Learners do transfer from our establishments to their establishments, so it's in our interest to ensure that we align our curriculum offer or how we deliver. So collaboration is good as much as it can be.
Thank you. And I know we're a little short of time here, but one more from me. Could you talk us through you talked about the prison education framework, but we haven't talked much about the dynamic purchasing system. Could you explain that to a lay member of the public who might be watching this?
Don't want to dominate. I'm quite happy to take it. So the dynamic purchasing system was new to PEF. It was something we hadn't seen prior to the OLAS provision. It was a new pot of funding that was available for prison governors to purchase ad hoc provision that perhaps they couldn't get through their core offer. So in the past, I used to work for the prison service, and I was sometimes frustrated as a head of learning skills that I couldn't buy in a drama production for a week to do a particular thing about this particular area because it couldn't be contracted through the current provider. So the dynamic purchasing system was supposed to be a tool that governors could look at need and say, actually, I can get that from my core provider, but I'd like to commission something bespoke for a set period of time or for a year that's bespoke to my prison that I can go out and procure, and it has more flexibility to allow a wider range of providers to bid for that resource. So we sometimes choose to bid for it, especially if it's around reading specialists that we've had or Senko provision. If we feel it's in our area of expertise, we will bid for that. And then sometimes we choose not to. If it's around some of the drama or other areas, we might leave that to another provider who's got better specialisms to come in and deliver.
I think it's really important in terms of enabling smaller organisations or specialist organisations or local organisations to engage with prisons in a way that they would never be able to engage with, a full lot of core education provision. They can bring in that expertise in areas that otherwise people in prison don't have access to, and particularly sports, creative activities, drama, those sort of things, but also things like peer reading schemes and really crucial work like that. It just gives prisons that flexibility to tailor their offer to the population that they're working with and their needs, and to try and make sure that there is a more rounded offer that offers a little bit more to people in prison. At the moment, contracts for that are a maximum of 2 years to give that flexibility. I can see why they want to retain that flexibility, but it is difficult for providers to, in a 2-year period, to get something up and running and make the most of it, and then before you know it, their contract's coming to an end. So there was a recommendation previously to look at extending the maximum length of those contracts. I think it is something to think about. We know it takes a while for organisations to get embedded into a prison and to get things operating.
Would you say there's scope to review the whole contracting process in the prison estate?
We're obviously about to go into a new set of contracts, so in a way that question's been answered for the foreseeable future. There was a programme that was due to be set up at the same time as these contracts, where 5 prisons were going to be taken out of the main education contracts so they could test different approaches and try and find different ways to see how they worked. I think that was a really good idea, just to enable prisons to try different, more local approaches or more tailored approaches. That programme's been brought to a stop and isn't going ahead at the moment. I think that's a missed opportunity to try other models and to see what else might have worked in terms of particularly enabling prisons to work with local providers to provide a greater variety, as well as specialists who obviously have that long-term knowledge in terms of providing prison education. So you do need to get that balance, but we would have liked to have seen that opportunity taken to innovate and to try things.
Thank you very much. Serena.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Back in September 2023, the previous government announced prison education service reform. So how have recent reforms, including the recruitment of a head of education skills and work and a neurodiversity support manager within prisons, helped to improve educational outcomes? And I'll go to John for that.
Of course. And I think those 2 particular reforms that you mentioned, so the introduction of the new senior level post focusing on education and neurodiversity support managers, were both things that we welcomed. We thought they were a positive step. We've heard already about the high levels of people with neurodiverse needs in prison, so bringing in a specialist to work on that has real value. And we think that bringing in new heads of education skills and work, so people with educational knowledge and expertise to support the governor and the senior management team in ensuring that the curriculum and that the education provision works for their prison has real value. I think it's quite early days in terms of embedding those reforms, and I think that those new people coming in, many of them didn't come from a prison background, some of them came from schools or adult education. So I think it's too early to say that it's had a transformational impact on outcomes, but where we've seen it in some prisons where it's working well, they're helping to improve and embed that partnership between the prison and the education provider, which is so important, because if you want this to work well, the prison has to enable the education provider to do their job, and the education provider has to work with the prison to give them the information that they need. So having someone who works for the prison but really gets the educational bit of it as well can have real value in improving that partnership, because where that partnership doesn't work well, where the two aren't working smoothly together, you're never going to get good quality education provision. So if those roles over time can develop to help to manage that partnership and help it to work appropriately, I think that'll have real value.
Thank you. Michala?
Nothing to add.
No?
Agree with John.
Okay, Annick?
Yeah, I think as John said, the ability to work in partnership with the heads of education, learning and skills is critical, and where we see that working well, we've seen some positive, good Ofsted inspections, Havering, Moorland, Ascombe Grange, we've got some really good partnerships and they've all been graded good. The ability for us as a provider to be successful in a prison, we have to have that partnership. It isn't our environment. It's not like an FE sector where we own the building and it's our college. We deliver a service in someone else's environment. So the partnership and the collaboration and that word enable that John used, we've got to be enabled to deliver a successful contract. Hold us to account for the quality of teaching and learning, but enable us to deliver the best service possible. So we welcome those roles, because those roles are about working out in the prison and engaging not just within education, engaging with the residential units to ensure that we can increase attendance. So yes, we welcome those roles because we need those roles to enable us to be successful.
Okay, and from your experience, how well is the head of education skills and work liaising with the governor of prisons, because the intention was that they were to work, shoulder to shoulder, hand in glove with each other. Is that the reality?
I think it's different in every prison. So a lot of the heads of education skills and work are managed by the governor and are part of the governor's senior leadership team in a prison, which is critical. And often our education managers are part of the senior leadership team, which is great as well. So I think that relationship's there. I think it's an evolving role, and I think they need some more support and guidance nationally in collaboration with each other as well. But yes, I've seen some good positive working with those relationships with the governor.
Excellent, because the ultimate ambition is for this government's approach is to deliver improved educational outcomes. So being a bit more solution focused now and focusing on best practice, are there particular examples that you could share with us today, starting with Annick?
Yeah, I think, we often look at best practice and about how we share that across our own prison network and with the other providers. We've talked about our collaboration with the other providers. We held a big conference where we got all providers together and we shared some of the good practice that we do across the sector. I think what we do in our kind of Yorkshire-based model, we have at the moment under the PEF contract a kind of end-to-end provision where we deliver all the kind of CIAG kind of advice and guidance at the start. We deliver all the core education and all the vocational offer. But then in Yorkshire, we have an additional resource called our Novus Works team, who support offenders through the gate into employment. So we pick them up, do all the assessment, do the skill development, but then when they're ready, we actually handhold them into the community. We go and support them in the community. We support the employers, because that's critical. We've got to talk to the employers and make them feel comfortable employing an ex-offender. And actually, our research with our employer network says 9 out of 10 of them will employ an ex-offender and feel them beneficial to their kind of workforce. We've got about over 1,000 learners so far into employment from that service in Yorkshire since we created it. So that end-to-end provision is critical to support the learner right through that whole learner journey.
I think the best independent assessment we have of how good prison education is Ofsted inspections, and relatively few of them in recent years have been good and none outstanding. So I think we do need to look at where prisons are achieving a good rating and decide what lessons we can draw from that. And over the last months and years, have been some prisons, particularly in the open estate, but elsewhere, that have achieved a good rating overall and good in different under different judgments. And I think it's really important that the prison service as a whole learns from what's achieving and takes those lessons into other prisons so they can make sure that best practice spreads that way. In general, I don't think prisons are always brilliant at sharing best practice between different prisons. So while the providers obviously run across several prisons and may collaborate with other providers, you need to make sure that best practice is being shared from the prison side as well. And I think Ofsted are now working much more with prison governors to talk through the results of their inspections. I think that's really positive. And we'd like to see more of that sort of sharing of best practice and enabling prisons that are struggling to learn from those that are doing better, because there are some examples of good practice out there. We need to make sure they're not confined to one prison or one area, but that are shared around the estate.
I think examples for the OU in terms of higher education are our prisons where we have dedicated OU wings, or we have dedicated time, dedicated purposeful activity that's organised with an individual governor or head of learning and skills and work. So we'll have an ICT suite where perhaps OU has donated ICT equipment to. We'll have open university student councils which contribute to the running of the regime of the prison, but it's very much dependent on a flexible and open approach to higher level education and providing prisoners with the ability to spend time in an ICT suite or a library, meet together and really drive forward either their open university learning or something that's really beneficial to the prison.
Okay, so with rehabilitation in mind, what one recommendation could you give to better improve educational outcomes for rehabilitation, starting with Annick?
I think very much just to ensure that, this Justice Select Committee really kind of understands that significant impact prison education can have. We talked about that research that proves it does have an impact on reducing reoffending. But then we've got to have that conversation about levelling up that funding. So if there's 4 times the need in prison than there is in the community, but the community's got 17% more provision for that level 2 or below than custody, we need a conversation about levelling up that funding for us to ensure that we can actually have an impact to those who need it most.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think as I've mentioned already, it's a move towards a more learner-centred, flexible approach that takes individuals with the needs they've got and where they are at that time and helps them move towards what they want to achieve in prison and when they leave. So if you want to have that more individual-focused, learner-focused approach, you are looking at resources, you're looking at recruiting and retaining the very best quality teachers and support staff, you're looking at digital. So it's an across the piece package of improvements, but I think you need to put the learner right at the centre of that, ensure that their particular needs are understood and met as they move through the prison estate and their prison journey.
Thank you. And finally, Michala.
Thank you. For me, prisons have been really successful and made a lot of progress by applying the principle of equivalence to healthcare and prisons working with healthcare trusts. I would like to consider that for education, and I think prisons working with education providers such as here today to apply that principle of equivalence so that we are modelling in our adult prisons and our young adult prisons what adult education is like outside. I think we'd be on a winning streak.
Thank you very much. Finally for this section, Lindsay.
Thank you. I'm interested in continuing education upon release, and I think we've all heard from you that there's clear evidence that education within prisons assists with reducing reoffending on the outside, and I think it was you, Annick, that talked about the risk of early release under certain schemes in emergency situations like we've seen with the SD40 had caused concerns for you in terms of recidivism. Would it be fair to say that continuing education, perhaps courses that you've not finished, particularly OU courses that tend to be quite a long commitment for learning, would you say that continuing those courses and finishing them is central to reducing reoffending for individuals?
Absolutely. And I think we then need to work with our community providers to ensure that that's accessible at a time when the offenders need it. So we know at the moment community provision has cohort learning, would start often in September. Now, if we've got an offender that's leaving about now, what are they going to do till then? So it's about the ability to engage into something in the community to continue that learning journey, because any gap in learning is a real risk for reoffending. So any continuation that's seamless into community provision or supported in the interim is definitely beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I absolutely agree with that. I think, and I mentioned before, kind of partnerships between prisons and FE colleges and universities and the communities they're going to be releasing people into helps to deal with bridging that gap. So both what people might do in the interim, but also looking at, as I mentioned before, using release on temporary licence so that people don't miss the start of a class if they can be released a few months early on Rotterdam. That does happen, and there is a provision for that in the rules, but it could happen a lot more, and we'd like to see more of it. If you have those strong partnerships, then people will understand what's required of them, and that will enable them to be more likely to be picked up as they go out into the community. And the second thing I'd say on this quickly is that at the moment, statistics are published routinely on the proportion of people leaving prison who go into employment, but there isn't equivalent for those people who go into education and training in the time after they leave prison. I get that it's a more difficult data set to gather, but I do think it would be valuable if we're thinking of the equivalent of people not in education, employment or training. I think it would be really useful to think what proportion of people are going into educational training and recognising that's a valid outcome for some people leaving prison, because it may be that by completing a course or by doing a course when they leave prison, or a qualification of some kind, they have better long-term outcomes than rushing straight into a job without completing a course they've started.
That's really interesting, because we are talking about NEETs quite a lot at the moment, people not in education, employment or training. So I think that's really interesting that there's no data collected specifically on prison release on that point. So thank you, Michala.
So for the OU being online and distance learning, it's fairly seamless if somebody is released, and we enable them to continue their study in the community. So we've actually, although we've seen an increase in early release, that hasn't hampered us. All we then do is transfer that learning, and if a OU prisoner student has certain licence conditions within the community, then we're able to provide them with the same secure VLE they experienced in prison, the same secure curriculum, and so it's a fairly seamless transition for us. But what we also do, because we can never know, and prisons never know when someone is going to be released all of the time, we make sure that upon registration with the Open University, we provide the learners with a through the gate learner pack with all the contact details and all the URLs that they need to access once they're in the community, if they're not under licence or and are not being reported to us as being released. So it is fairly seamless. It isn't without fault, but it's a fairly positive picture for us.
I mean, I think that in itself is an example of best practice, when it works, and
yes.
It sounds like it's a really good scheme that you've, or system that you've got there. Generally, are there any other examples of good practice, and are there any other opportunities that you can see that would really help to support prison leavers into the community continuing with their education? So are there any gaps and opportunities, or have you got any examples of where something is happening that's going particularly well, beyond the one that you've already given us?
Yeah, I think for us it's again the pockets of work we're doing with digital technology and digital education providers. Our idea being that devices are then gifted to OU students to take them through the gate. So they've got their record of learning on there, they've got all the assistive software they need, and they can just continue their learning on that device once released.
I think the ability to use some of the apprenticeship framework now would be definitely beneficial for offenders leaving custody. So we do have a pilot now working with the prison service, and they have changed some of the legislation around apprenticeships. So that's early stages, but I think that could really take off, because that apprenticeship route way for a lot of our offenders is very successful.
And the requirement to have GCSE English and Maths has been removed.
Yes.
So does
Yes.
that open up apprenticeships now?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Very briefly, so for our learners who we fund, they own the course that they do, so they can continue it in the community, and we will help them to smooth that journey if required. So we run an advice line. People can call us and ask for help to recontact their course supplier and continue with their course. It's obviously often a very disruptive time, but we try and support people who want to do that. I think there are other examples of good practice. So, for example, in Gloucestershire, there's a partnership between a prison and an FE college who provide a kind of personal training type qualification, but they work with prison leavers and provide wraparound support, career guidance and support towards achieving the qualification. So there are these pockets and bits of best practice, and as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the challenges is that often no one knows about them, so they go on in isolation because an enterprising governor or local FE college principal makes them happen because they think it's a really good thing to do, but you don't hear about them, so they don't get replicated elsewhere.
More joined up approach for re-entry into the community might be useful, would you say?
I think absolutely, and I think we talked about the new senior roles. I think part of their role is within the prison, looking in at what they're doing, but also we'd like to see in terms of the new heads of education, skills and work, them looking out and thinking about what they can bring in from the community, which both broadens the offer and also potentially brings in additional resource. So, for example, there's an open prison that has a partnership with a local FE college, and the FE provision is funded from the adult education budget, not from the prison budget. So people go out to that on a daily basis on Rottle, and that's an additional resource the prison wouldn't have access to otherwise. So I think developing those sorts of partnerships and looking at how they work so that other people can learn from them and maybe not exactly replicate them because every prison is different, but learn the lessons from them and develop something similar would have real benefits.
Would you like to see links with businesses on the outside as well, taking people through perhaps with apprenticeships or some sort of link where they would local businesses might support funding for education in the prison and then jobs on the outside when they come out?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's happening now. So our curriculum offer, in particular around some of the vocational training, it is all something we called employer endorsed. So it's often sometimes branded their department. So we have a Green King Academy that we will use and develop, and then they'll progress into the Green King community. We used to have a Pret Academy through Pret a Manger. We work with Fred Syriacs and the Right Course, and that works into all the kind of hospitality and catering industry. So all our curriculum offer is employer endorsed. Sometimes that's just the employer giving us some guidance about the curriculum design, and then the nth degree is where they take them through the gate and employ them directly in their business. So the more of that, the better, because that route way into business is critical.
We've got some MPs sitting here thinking about the businesses in their constituency that might be able to help.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great. Sorry, John, were you going to?
I agree with that. I think that sort of work is really valuable. I think there's a sort of, as you'll know, there's been employment advisory boards set up in prison to try and improve the link between prisons and employers. Also going to be regional employment councils trying to do the same thing. I think all that work is really valuable, and I think an essential part of it is making sure that where people are doing courses and particularly qualifications in prison, they are the qualifications and the experiences that employers want, so that people don't spend their time and energy doing a course and then find out when they get out that it's not really got any value. So our work, part of that is making sure that our courses are the right ones. I think you need to see that across the whole estate so that people, when they get out, the qualification they've got has actual value in the community.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
I've just got two very quick fire. Honestly, I promise.
I'm looking at the time.
I know. Can I just ask you, you mentioned a helpline. Do you run helplines that are free?
So we do. So we run a free advice line, so it's free for people in prison to call if they've got questions.
Not when you're in prison, when you're out.
Or when you're out. So, the courses that we provide are only provided to people in prison. But if someone's left prison and wants to call us to ask about the course they were doing in prison, we will take that call from them. Of course we will.
Is it free?
Yes, be free for within prison or outside.
Thank you. And then the other question I was going to ask you were talking about effectively gifting the kit, the equipment. Is that common? And can they take their equipment from one prison to another when they're moved? Does their kit go with them?
Again, it depends on the individual prison, but that's the idea, is that device moves with them for the duration of their study.
Literally pick it up and take it with them so they don't have the break.
Correct.
Thank you.
Funding for that is raised through philanthropic endeavour through the Open University.
Thank you very much, everyone. Particularly thank you to our witnesses. You can see how much we value your testimony as we overrun by about half an hour. But thank you very much indeed for coming along and sharing your expertise with us. We have a second panel, which is called Prison Experts, Prison Education Experts, not that you weren't. But I'm just going to adjourn the committee just for 2 minutes so we can change the panels over. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Order, resuming Justice Select Committee for this afternoon with our second panel of experts in prison education. I will just ask them briefly to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Owston.
Good afternoon. I'm Owston. I'm one of His Majesty's Inspectors and I'm Ofsted's National Director for Education.
Hello, I'm Jo Grady and I am the General Secretary of UCU who represent educators in post-16 education and specifically here in prisons.
Hello, I'm Victoria Barnett. I'm the Chair of the Sillet Prison Libraries Group and I manage 5 prison libraries in Kent.
So we're very grateful for your attendance this afternoon. There are a number of members of the Justice Select Committee and Mark Seward and Serena Brackenridge who are guesting here from the Education Committee this morning, but we'll all have a few questions for you. I'm just going to start off with 1 or 2 general questions. What role do you believe supporting prisoners' educational outcomes has in supporting efforts towards rehabilitation?
Shall I start with that one? absolutely crucial. Ofsted exists to raise standards and improve lives, and if we're not doing that as a nation, particularly for our most disadvantaged and vulnerable, then we're not doing the job that we need to do. And obviously, as an inspectorate, we see a very clear disconnect between the ambition we all have, and that education is truly transformative, and obviously what that then means for prisoners in terms of rehabilitation and resettlement, and the reality of what we see on the ground. And just to give you a few headline figures, from our inspections last year, 86% of prisons, so where we evaluate prison education, were less than good. Just over half were actually inadequate, and there were no outstanding providers. So it is exceptionally weak in terms of the quality of prisoner education, and that's why we're really pleased to be contributing to the panel's evidence collection.
Thank you. Anyone want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll go next. So before I get onto that, I just wanted to say one introductory and kind of contextual thing. So at UCU, we represent 120,000 people across post-16 education. 1,000 of those are prison educators. And it was interesting listening to the earlier panel, because I don't think the remarkable and sometimes, demanding and dangerous job that they do was sort of fully acknowledged. And I just wanted to put on record our appreciation for them, and I'm sure that's shared by the committee. Because I think a precondition to most of what I will say today is the lack of valuing of prison educators, the lack of focus on their working conditions, and the contracting out system in particular, and how that has, I think, reinforced low pay and reinforced a professional body that don't have autonomy, has made things worse. And I think it's very difficult to deliver education and to be focused on rehabilitation when you are working within a system that means every 4 to 5 years you're potentially contracted out, that you go through TUPE, that you're working in a system where the contracting out ensures that, one of the mechanisms that providers are judged on is whether or not they are doing it cheaply. And the person who is squeezed in the middle of that is the worker. So what we're seeing with the contracting out is that the contracting out system is really squeezing as much value out of the staff that deliver education, rather than the contracting out supporting them to do that. And I know we're going to get into this more, and I know that you've seen our evidence. One of our members gave us this quotation in a survey we did, which said, "I want to rehabilitate inmates, not fulfill a company contract at any cost." And I think that we really feel this contracting out is getting in the way of us doing proper rehabilitation in the UK. Well, in England specifically.
Why did you want to?
I haven't got much to add to that, but I would say that where the library's position is not formal education as such, but it's an opportunity for people to do some self-learning, to discover more about themselves, to find things that interest them, to take them on into the future. We have a lot of problems with people not being able to get to the library, and we have a lot of feedback from prisoners about the psychological impact that has on them, about their ability to serve their time in a positive way, and how the library time is the most decent, civilised part of the week, as it's the only calm place in the prison. And I think that is something that we need to build on.
Thank you very much. I might have other questions later, but I will now bring in Mark Seward, if I may.
Thank you very much, Chair. Lee, you've already stated that 86% of all inspections, was it within 5 years?
That's just over the last year.
Oh, that's just over the last year. Well, something like 87% of all inspections over the last 5 years have been inadequate or requires improvement. So the state of prison education is not good. What needs to be done to improve it?
Good question. I think there are some practical issues that actually don't even touch upon the quality of education itself. And I think the Chair mentioned this at the start of the previous panel, your physical barriers around, are there enough activity spaces? So if you have a classroom that fits 15 prisoners, but you have far more than that need the education in the classroom, then how do you manage that? Are those spaces, when there are enough available, used to their best effect? There are obviously shortages not only in those that are qualified to teach and that want to teach in that space, but equally in terms of prison officers, because if you have fewer prison officers, then you can't actually escort prisoners from their wing or their cell to where the learning is happening. So they're kind of physical barriers that are not even touching upon the quality once prisoners are in the classroom or accessing vocational learning. I would say there needs to be a greater investment in training. So I think Joe picked up on this in terms of previous panel members. Equity across all of the education landscape in terms of, do you get the same amount of pay if you are an FE tutor or working in a prison versus a school? So if you are highly qualified as a teacher, where do you best see your skills being used? And actually the range of provision. So again, what the previous panel members said to you, that it's not as broad as it needs to be. It is very narrow in terms of those very first entry qualifications, and it doesn't allow prisoners to then progress in terms of wherever else they might want to go in their education.
And before I move on to the other panel members, is there a core reason, a central reason, a reason that keeps coming up as to why so many are being declared inadequate?
I'd say, is there that true investment in education against all of the other priorities that governors and leadership teams have across the prison estate? Does every governor see education as important as, say, obviously the safety of prisoners, but also funding, overcrowding, etc.? So I think there is something about leadership and management and constancy in terms of, are you there long enough to instigate change and see it through, or is there constant churn and new people bringing in new ideas before others have had time to embed?
That's interesting. So it's a lot. You would say that it's about the leadership of the prisons as opposed to the safeguarding. Because often in schools, I'm a maths teacher in another life, it's safeguarding is the number one reason that people tend to become inadequate, but it's actually leadership and management when it comes to prisons.
And the priority that's put on education, and I would obviously say also it's around, have we been swift enough, particularly in terms of reading, because we produced a report, I think it's 3 years ago this month, and the recommendations in that report are being very slowly implemented, but there are only minimal gains across those last 3 years.
Thank you very much, Lee. And then to the other panel members, in your view, what are the barriers to take up of prison education by prisoners? What's stopping people who want to take up education in prisons to taking up education?
There's a few things that I would highlight. One you discussed earlier is attendance. So from our perspective, consistent data is not collected on lack of attendance in prisons. From our research, there's sort of two broad reasons. One is a chronic and persistent shortage of prison officers. Can you imagine, from prisoners to be taken from the wing to a classroom, they're often taken and then held in a room. And then they will be taken to the classroom. If there's a shortage of prison officers, that just won't happen. So we see that as a huge barrier. Another one is the rather punitive restrictions that you have in prisons around toilet breaks. So again, this is just, you can imagine yourself as an educator. Prisoners are only allowed a single toilet break in a 3-hour session. If they've been taken off the wing up to an hour before attending that session, and many prisoners will cite this as a reason that they don't attend. I won't rehearse in front of you, but we have had some, pretty appalling stories from our educators of students urinating in classrooms. So, it's just a reason students don't attend. A few other reasons. I am going to cite this as a reason students, don't get what they should do in the classroom is low pay. We do have chronic low pay in prison education. In England, you alluded to this. College lecturers are paid less than school teachers, and our prison lecturers are paid even less. So we have courses that students don't know will run. People leave. It's really poor for students. The prison estate is another reason which I think should be crucial for this committee to consider. So, if you want to think about trauma-informed education, which we heard, a few times in the earlier session, it's a meaningless phrase if it's not delivered efficiently or meaningfully. And one example that one of our members gave us is they delivered horticulture classes to students. So some students, that's the kind of teaching that they need, education that they engage in. They had the ability to develop proper skill sets in patches that students could go outside and learn in. Without any consultation, these were bulldozed. And now that person has to teach inside in pots. Another issue, I'll give you one more before we move on, is to return again to the contracting out that we have, which essentially means that these things are renegotiated. And I think we heard, I'm really sorry, I can't remember which panel member was asking the colleague from Novus about why is this available here but isn't available there. You're contracting out. So we don't have either the MOJ or the DFE saying here are the things that learners should have access to, and here is how we are going to ensure that every learner can have access to that. What we have instead is 4 at the moment, soon it will be 3 different providers competing with each other and effectively trying to be the lowest cost provider that they can, and education is just not at the forefront of that. So that's all of those things combined, I think, just present huge barriers to students in prisons.
Victoria, anything to add as to why or what would stop prisoners from taking up education right now?
Well, a lot of it is educational trauma, not wanting to go back into a classroom. And people will come to the library and be happy to teach themselves in their own way, slowly. We had a woman in our female prison who learnt to read completely from just borrowing children's books, and her cellmate taught her to read, and by the time she left prison she'd read hundreds of books. She was our biggest reading group member. But one of the biggest barriers for people getting to the library is staff in prisons. The library officer is the first person to go. If there is a shortage of staff in another area of the prison, the library officer will be taken away. So sometimes people only get 20 minutes in the library, and that may be once a week. Sometimes if they're very lucky that week might get twice a week, and they might get onto that list again. But the limited number of times they can come to the library is severely impacted when they take away that officer for no good reason or no reason that's told to the prisoners, so they get really frustrated. And then there's the contracting issues in that our library services are very patchy across the country. There's brilliant prison libraries and there are not so brilliant prison libraries, and there's not really any kind of standardisation or benchmark to work to, and the contracts don't reflect that.
Could I add something else on special educational needs? Because it came up in the last panel. We know that special educational needs, has had increased funding. We are better at spotting special educational needs, of encouraging parents to spot it. And as a society, this is something we have, therefore, higher rates of diagnosis of now. This is not a trend that you are seeing carried into, in our experience, the prison population in terms of extra investment in special educational needs, extra resources, and therefore extra time for learners. So given that we disproportionately know that there are higher levels of neurodivergency and special educational needs in prisons, you then have a prison workforce that is dealing with a disproportionately high classroom of those needs, but with less investment, with staff that are less invested in, and as you've just highlighted, with less access to the things that would be helpful. So despite the fact that we know this is a trend across society that we've got better at, we haven't copied that across into prison education whatsoever.
Yeah, and before I go on to my last question, Lindsay.
Thank you, Dr. Joe. You've hit on something that's really important to me and my colleagues in Derbyshire, and Lee will know that Derbyshire County Council and the ICB have recently failed quite dramatically an Ofsted report on their SEND provision. So I'm really interested in hearing what you're saying. And I know MOJ data shows that 55% of prisoners have, when they took their initial assessment on entry into prison, that they had learning difficulties or disabilities. So I'm really interested. I know, Dr. Joe, that you've said we are getting better as a society at the outside, but what impact is the sorts of issues? I'm not necessarily asking you, Lee, to comment on Derbyshire specifically, but in an area or where the situation is where children aren't being provided with that SEND provision that they are entitled to on the outside, what is the impact on prisons on the inside that is dealing with potential offenders that are coming through the system?
I think
I'll yeah.
Well, basically, a lot of the prisoners that we know have got special needs, special educational needs, are not diagnosed on the outside. They come in and they tell us that they've got those needs, but they're not diagnosed on the outside. And from what I understand, the neurodiversity managers, they're doing a great job, but I think they're not allowed to diagnose people with those special needs. So they can put some support in place that they think they might need, but I don't think they're allowed to diagnose.
And if I can give you some personal anecdotes from our educators. So when I was first elected in 2019 as General Secretary, I spoke to a remarkable prison educator that was a member of ours. She was the daughter of a mother who'd been a prison educator, and I remember speaking to her about how dangerous prisons are, that there's no soap and water, that she had to take her own toilet roll to work with her, like basic things that you would expect. And as a fellow teacher, I said to her, I know the answer as to why people carry on teaching when it's hard, but why do you keep on doing it? And she worked with young men in a youth offender estate, and she said, because when I teach young men how to read, they are going home able to read stories, bedtime stories to their children. And I know that I am making a huge change and a difference to the trajectory of their lives and to the trajectory of their children's and potentially other people in their communities. That woman is no longer a prison educator, because she couldn't stay working in a job that was so low paid, despite being so intergenerationally committed to this. So I think, yes, there are people coming to prison that aren't diagnosed, and I agree with that, but then there are people who come into this profession to stay and are dedicated, who, with all respect to our colleague from Novus earlier, I was kind of staggered to hear some of the things she was saying about low pay, because Novus are part of the issue as to why pay is so low in prison education, as well as the funding. So there's multiple things that are connected, which I think we could address in a better way.
Could I bring in Mark for his final question and then go to you, Tess? Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I know in the interest of time, I'll keep it brief. So this is to Lee again. This is changing track a little bit. So the Chief Inspector of Ofsted said, it cannot be right that some children spend up to 23 hours each day alone in their cells with no access to education or other pursuits that might improve their chances of rehabilitation. So that ends the quote. Why is the picture of education in youth offender institutes so bleak, especially since we've actually had a decrease in the youth custody population?
I don't think it's prioritised. I think, linked back to my previous answer to you about leadership and management, I think particularly in the young offender institutions, we're lucky if we see a governor for a year and then they're moved on somewhere else. So in the establishments where we need to make the greatest difference, or potentially can make the greatest difference for reoffending, and ultimately where they may end up in terms of prison, we're not dedicating that focused leadership management time to get things right. There is significant issues around behaviour in YOIs, which is why you hear about children being locked behind closed door for too many hours of the day, not being able to access classrooms or education. Some of that comes back to how well equipped staff feel to deal with the most challenging behaviours, physical violence, verbal abuse, and therefore the easier solution is not necessarily to train staff to deal with that, but obviously to separate those young people. And indeed, education is not in those institutions, is not being designed in the right way, in that decisions are being made, linked back to behaviour, about where children should be and what they should learn based on whether they will be able to be in the same room as another young offender, not on whether that's something that they need to learn next. So their safety of staff and other young offenders has been taken as the priority rather than what it is they're learning in the first place.
Have you seen any best practice at all that you think could be applied to organisations where it's not working?
The three YOIs, two are inadequate and one requires improvement, so
right.
It's very difficult to pinpoint best practice to support the system.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just go back to something? I want to go reverse a little bit. It was something that you said about the assessment of special educational needs and other thing. I think you said, if I'm right, Victoria, you said that prisoners came in and they hadn't been assessed, and that they told you what they
believe
their experience
so they
was.
haven't had an official diagnosis.
Okay, so I'm checking my understanding of what happened in a previous session, which was that as prisoners enter the system, they are assessed. Does that mean, what does that mean? Does that mean they have a... is that just somebody going, well, I think you've got this and I think you've got that?
I think
or are they
tested
professionals?
For maths and English. I'm not sure. We'll have to come back on that one.
Because you write to the chair about that? Because
yes.
I want to really understand, because I have misunderstood. I had thought that an assessment was done by somebody who... You're shaking your heads. This is very alarming. So this is just some prison officer going, you know, can you read, can you write, can you add up?
The neurodiversity manager.
Sorry, who?
There's now neurodiversity managers in prisons.
Oh, is there?
That's a fairly new
How are they
role.
qualified?
Don't know.
Recheck that, please.
Well, they wouldn't
they
wouldn't be qualified to diagnose in the way that say an educational psychologist would within the world education system.
So do prisoners see? Is an assessment done by an ed psych? Is it? Is he? She?
No. So from inspection experience, it's typically a screening check that is at the very minimum lowest level. Often, can you read or not?
Oh.
And then, you know, education is planned from that perspective.
I also think there's the reality of, you know, the understaffed prison, the contracted out education in the understaffed prison. So, you know, there will be statements about we provide this, and I think, you know, you teased it out quite nicely with the education, with the technology in the earlier session. Statements about what we do, and then what practically happens on the ground. If there isn't prison officers to transport someone to an assessment, that might happen at some point in the future, or it may be a much more superficial assessment than you would expect. And I think that's the reality of prison education.
I'd be very grateful if the three of you would write to the chair about your perception or experience of what actually happens, because it sounded quite nice what I heard before, and I'm slightly alarmed now. Thank you.
You're right to be alarmed, though, because then I'm going to make the case right now that, in my opinion, the continuation of contracted out education in prisons is not compatible with delivering rehabilitation. That what you have is a system of, you know, different providers making commitments to do things which they're, to be fair to them, are not always in control of doing, because they're not in control of understaffing in prisons. But the education is not at the forefront. Having students turn up or not turn up, and having staff deliver to students who are either there or aren't there, is just what they are doing. The rehabilitative goals are not there, and they're not woven into the fabric of what they're doing.
Can I just add one thing, and it comes back to Lindsay's. I think I didn't get to answer the send comment, which is, as an organisation, we absolutely want to be better at joining the dots. As an organisation, we inspect everything from childminders all the way through early years, schools, colleges, apprenticeships, and obviously up to prison education. We need to be better at knowing where learners fall through the gaps, and then what we can report back to Parliament and to others in terms of where do we need to turn our attention next. And one of the things we need to be much better at is how do we use our information from area send inspection to better identify where institutional level practice needs to be even better. So that's something that we're proposing to do even better
What you're saying is that you need to find out where the dots are, and we don't even have that. Oh God.
I need to move on. Pam, I was going to come to you anyway.
Yes, thank you. Returning to contracting of prison education, Lee, can I ask you, in your view, as in your Ofsted capacity, does the current commissioning framework work well to provide education services to prisoners?
That's a difficult question for me to answer on behalf of an inspector, because we do not look at commissioning in terms of the inspections that we undertake. We look at the quality of the education that prisoners are receiving. Whoever delivers that, we're focused on the impact that it has. We don't look at the commissioning process, although the inspection statistics, where only 8 prisons out of the last 35 we've inspected had good quality of education would give you an indication of what that offer looks like, but we don't inspect at a commissioning level.
But just to recap what you said in one of your opening answers, that 86% of prison education in the last year has been found to be less than good, and a decent proportion of that was found to be inadequate. So that would seem to me to suggest, as a former educator myself, that the framework that's delivering that is somehow not
and obviously
performing.
the estate is looking at how they improve that. And I think, as a previous panelist said, that there's new commissions being undertaken as we speak. It's in the process of going through.
And just to push a little more on it, the 2023-24 annual report by HMI Prisons said prison leaders struggle to hold their education providers to account where services were ineffective. Do you have a view on why that might be?
I think that there's no mechanism, so there isn't, in terms of an accountability level, there isn't a mechanism. As I said, we don't look at commissioning, and therefore it doesn't contribute to part of our evidence collection in terms of how is that relationship working. We simply report on whether it is making a difference for prisoners or not. Okay, thank you. And Joe, you've indicated a view on commissioning. Perhaps you'd reiterate it here. You've called for UCU have called for a comprehensive review of the curriculum and contracting framework before the prison education service is implemented. So why are you arguing that?
There's a few reasons. One, we think that the prison education service and the PEF before is just a tendering process. So it doesn't put, I think, the issues that you've been asking about at the heart of what is happening. And, one aspect of that is the way in which PES seeks to kind of, in quite a punitive way, claw back funding. So 10% of funding from providers if teaching hours are lost. There's some things I won't defend teaching providers for, but lost teaching is not one of them. They're not in control of that, and that just seems like a really bizarre thing to do. We haven't been consulted, the voice of the prison education workforce about this. We've been excluded from the panel. But I think the thing that I would say is that, if we are wanting to equip learners not to just re-enter the workforce, but to be rehabilitated and have a kind of a broader engagement with curriculum, this contracting out framework is one that really easily reduces education to just box ticking and benchmarking over rehabilitation. We think that we need to entrench things that are different in prison education, things that allow flexible teaching practices. And I think, you discussed the benefits of that before, which attend to both the emotional and psychological needs, as well as the intellectual potential of students in prison, developing soft skills as well as emotional resilience, building critical thinking capabilities, encouraging reading for pleasure. These things aren't really compatible with the system as it currently stands. And it's why we really think there needs to be a comprehensive review before it is rolled out. I will just say one more thing, if you'll permit me as well. The perpetual contracting in this cycle of every 4 to 6 years. At the moment, in the providers that will go forward, 2 of them are colleges. So the staff that get taken by those colleges will have access to the teachers' pension scheme. Those who end up going to People Plus, if they've been in TPS, will be tupied out of it. So it's not just bad for learners and for the state of prison education. Those staff are, we as a union or those staff are either going to have to enter into some kind of dispute to try and remain in the pension scheme, or they're going to be transferred out, and they could be transferred back in 4 to 5 years' time. So there's just so many aspects of it that don't work.
And that's Western College and Milton Keynes College?
Yes. So People Plus is the private provider, right. and Novus is part of the LTE group, Manchester College. So for us, the DFE is the home where education should sit. And I forget her name now, but our colleague from the Open University, she said, we should model this on healthcare. Well, we don't have all these private providers in healthcare. If we were going to model it on healthcare, we would be saying either the MOJ or the DFE are the ones that should set the standards, are the ones that should say this is how we expect the money to be spent, and this is, what we want our learners to have access to. And these are the educational, pedagogical priorities that we want them to have. Instead, we have this absolute mess, and I'm picking on Novus a bit because they were here, but You know, we have chronically low pay for our teachers in prison education. They are walking out of the door, and yet the people who are the very senior managers in, our education providers are on £220,000 to £240,000. So I'm not saying there's loads of profit being creamed in prison education, but there's a lot of very senior, well-paid people, and the people are actually delivering this on the ground and doing really tricky jobs under difficult circumstances. They're not.
Thank you. Can I just add something to that? There are all these different providers, and they don't seem, I've been through quite a few in my time, and they don't seem to have very much different offering. But what I will say is it doesn't matter who does the education provision. If the prison don't back it, and the senior managers can back it, and actually the heads of education skills and work have been, in my experience, really good. They've really improved access to education. But if you've got officers who don't see the point of education and who don't see the point of sending people to the library and don't go and get them out of their cell and wake them up and say, come on, it's time to go now, it doesn't matter how good your education provision is or how brilliant your library is. If people are not getting there, it's a waste of money.
That's a good cue, because I think, Lindsay, you have some questions on libraries.
I have some questions about prison libraries as somebody who was celebrating World Book Day with my children last week and having long conversations about reading for pleasure. I was heartened to read in our brief that the Prison Rules 1999 say that a library should be provided in every prison, and subject to the directions of the Secretary of State, every prisoner should be allowed to have library books and to exchange them. Is that the reality?
Well, that's no longer the rule. They don't have to have a minimum of 20 minutes because it was impossible to implement, actually. When you've got thousands of prisoners and you're saying that everyone can go to the library, actually, if everyone did want to go to the library, it wouldn't be possible. But can we just go back to what a library is in a prison, actually? I've written down some notes here so that I don't forget things. Prison libraries, you're right, prison libraries are a statutory requirement. A prison library, like a public library, is not just a place that offers books. It's a community space that brings a diverse range of people together in a normalising environment, and that's really key because prisoners always tell us it's the one place where they feel they can be normal and have proper interactions, and it's all about the pro-social modelling. It's also a place, really importantly, to connect families and encourage family literacy. So things like World Book Day. We celebrate those things in the prison, and we encourage prisoners to engage with their children about reading, and through lots of programmes like Storybook Dads, Raising Readers, which if you want to know about, I can tell you all about. And that family literacy, as well as the prison literacy, helps to break those cycles of reoffending. It's a place to envisage a positive future. Prisoners can come in, take part in competitions, learn something new, discover something they might like to take on as a future career, because a lot of them realise that what they were doing they won't be able to do with a criminal record. So they're looking for other opportunities. Often it's starting a business for themselves, and they can get that information in the library. It's also a place for vital legal research and information from reliable sources provided by trained librarians. Librarians were rated as trusted by 93% of the population in a 2021 Ipsos Mori poll, and libraries are seen as safe places that people can trust. It's a place for health information and improving health outcomes and health literacy. And it's not just the space, it's a combination of the space and the staff that brings something special. The fact that people can't get to the library and use that opportunity. And also, what we're finding now is that because of the contracting issues, some of the libraries are being taken over by people who don't know how to run libraries. They're relying on donations. The books should be bought by professional staff who understand their customers, who are buying books that are appropriate for those people. So they understand special needs, they understand what people want to read. Because actually, although you've got a lot of people who can't read and who might come and learn to read, you've got a large number of people who can read very well and will go completely mad without really good access to good quality stock. just to pass the time and a bit of escapism. So that, and also libraries, what we lose in that contracting issue where it's going to different providers, some of them the education providers, you lose that connection with the outside library, and the outside library is this community space which is really important for reintegration back into society. So where you've got prisoners coming out, we're trying to do a project at the moment with the British Library actually to engage with the probation services so that there's a more formal path from the prison library, from somebody who's never been in a library in their life before, has discovered the joys of reading and all the things that a library can offer them. And we want to continue that journey on the outside.
It's really interesting, thank you. The staffing that you mentioned, the having somebody who's specialised, who provides the staff for the library? Is that a prison role? No. Is it an educator role?
It's in most prisons, the library is provided by the local authority. So they are local authority. They're paid by the local authority and provided by the local authority. So they would have the training that local authority librarians have. They have access to the stock in the local library. There's all those benefits that come from having those trained staff. But if you lose that, you're really just having a room full of books that aren't necessarily appropriate stock, and that somebody who's serving a 20-year sentence will be bored within 6 months.
Well, that leads nicely on to a question that was on my mind, because we were told that initial assessments that we've already talked about, and you've heard evidence earlier that I think Annick said 62% had a literacy need of level 2, and I think our stats say 65% of those assessed had reading levels of 1 to 3, essentially primary school aged reading levels. I know you talked about the lady that was reading children's books initially. What sort of stock is there in terms of not everyone's going to want to read children's books?
No. So what we want to do is encourage people to come into the library, and that's the first step actually. Once they're in the library, we can engage with them and find them something to read. Now, for non-readers, there is graphic books, so graphic novels, and they can learn, the basics of following a story, and they build up. And we've got lots of books for different reading levels, so you can start on your very basic and move up. Children's books actually, although it might seem a bit patronising to have children's books, we have children's books because a lot of prisoners can read to their children over the phone. Mm-hmm. So prisoners who can't read can borrow those books and pretend that they're going to read to somebody over the phone and actually use them to learn to read on the quiet. Not everybody wants to engage with Shannon Trust, because if you're seen with a Shannon Trust mentor, I can't read. Everyone knows now that I can't read. So there are ways of people sidling into the library and just finding something to help themselves. And actually that self-learning is really important. And then it can lead on to the more formal education. But actually stepping into a classroom is too much for some people.
And I think throughout this session, we've heard evidence from yourself to really support the idea that libraries will support prisoners in terms of their rehabilitation. But I think you recently wrote to members of this committee with your concerns about the risk to libraries in prisons. Why are they currently at risk, and what needs to change to make sure that they're not at risk going forward?
So I've mentioned the contracting issues. The current contract has made it impossible for some local authorities to continue to provide library services, because they can't provide library services at a loss. The library outside can't support the library inside. And that is a really difficult one, because we're losing some local authorities who provide a really good library service in the prison. And what steps into that void is somebody who doesn't know how to run a library and just thinks that it's books. And it's especially education providers, where it will become like a school library, because actually what's really, really important in a prison is that distinction between education and library. We don't want to be an add-on to education. It needs to be seen as a separate department. We have our own managers, we have our own way of running, and we're not part of education. And often we are lumped in with education. And actually that's not very helpful for some prisoners who would engage with the library but don't want to engage with education.
Thank you for making that point, because I was definitely putting libraries in with education, and clearly you've set out, Victoria, the difference between the staff in the library and the sorts of staff that Dr. Joe's been talking about who have their own challenges.
Yeah, and there is a bit of a misunderstanding as well in some discussions that I've been in where people have said, well, librarians can teach people to read. They can't. That's not their skill set. That should be teachers doing that. Librarians can help people find something appropriate to read. They can support them on that journey, but they don't actually teach people to read. We do have, I'm speaking for Kent here because I can't speak for every prison library in the country, but we do have sessions where people who with very low literacy can come in and do word games and puzzles and things with the staff, and the staff are brilliant actually at engaging them. And things like Storybook Dads, you don't need to be able to read to do Storybook Dads. And one of the most amazing bits of feedback we get a lot of feedback from prisoners. They love telling us about what they get from our service. But this man had come to the library, he couldn't read, and our staff persuaded him that he could do a Storybook Dads anyway for his 2 young children. And they worked through. So they tell him what the line says, and then he does it, and then it was recorded and edited and beautifully done. And when he left the prison, he asked his mother to write a card to the staff to thank them. And he said that he was so overwhelmed by how his children had enjoyed this story that he had now decided to learn to read because he wanted to be able to read them a story himself properly.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Victoria.
Can I just ask a practical question? How many prisons have a Storybook Dads scheme, to your knowledge?
I'll have to get back to you on that one. It's something that we pay for. It's not free. It's a charity. I'd like to say every single prison. I would say probably most prisons have Storybook Dads.
Thank you. I could talk to you for hours about libraries.
I could talk for hours about libraries.
I'm very conscious that the chair is glaring at me, so I'll leave it there if I may.
You'll draw attention to my slapdash chair. We are nearly at the end, but before we do end, final question from Serena.
Yes, so as we come to an end, it's quite a poignant question, and that is, I'd like you to share an example of best practice where education is working well to promote rehabilitation. So I'll start with Lee.
Yeah, and this is from the prison estate in terms of best practice, yes. But I had the pleasure of kind of visiting Kirk Levington very recently in terms of some of the approaches they're taking, and I think it was about their absolute engagement with local employers and an understanding of what local skills needs were, so that there were those opportunities for when prisoners were released. Indeed, they were able to day release to go and do some of that work, so that there was already a relationship between them and employers for when they moved back into society. So I think really close working with local employers and being aware of what kind of vocational training prisoners may need. So again, in that example where I visited, training people up to be baristas, because there's a boom, isn't there, in terms of the coffee houses and the coffee industry, and it was also a dual benefit in that they'd set up their own coffee house at the edge of the prison, and the community could come and have coffee and cake, and prisoners were getting the social skills of interacting and also developing their skills that they'd got through their vocational training program. So I think one big bit of best practice is that really close relationship with local employers, so that there are those opportunities that prisoners are being trained for when they do come to be back in the community.
Thank you, Lee. Jo?
I think if you want long-term evidence-based, best practice examples of where rehabilitation is working, I'm afraid to say I don't think you're going to find it in England. I think you need to be looking at, countries where prison education is either, publicly funded or structured very differently to here. And I'd be pointing out Norway, places where we don't have a fragmented privatised system like the one that we have right here in England. So, I'm afraid I don't really have a positive example for something long-term and evidence-based for you.
Okay, so there isn't anything from your members?
I think we have, you know, experiences of our members, a bit like the one that I spoke about earlier, where when they are given space within the prison to do things like horticulture, and they are given proper space outside, and, you know, the prison is staffed properly so that students don't miss out on classes because of, you know, the urination issue that I talked about earlier. But we don't see that happening consistently here. So I'm not saying that there aren't pockets where these things do happen and can happen, but what happens? We see the horticultural garden getting bulldozed over and turned into a car park. We see chronic understaffing that the POA have talked about, you know, at length, and the degradation of their own employment conditions, meaning that students pay the price. We have a highly complex, not fit for purpose, fragmented, privatised system, which means that, you know, the contract that prison educators have actually just squeezes value out of them, quite literally sometimes their pension, and doesn't support them to be able to teach students properly. And I really think that we should take inspiration, and I hope this committee does, from where it is done differently elsewhere, and that we have, you know, a national prison contract in England, and that we move towards a national prison education service where we set expectations and we don't just leave it to private providers to maybe do those things, or for it to be delivered, you know, in ways that aren't monitored. As I said, you know, non-attendance isn't routinely monitored. And that, you know, we've had 2 reviews in the last 10 years, the Coates review, and there was another one in 2022. They talked at length about poor pay, lack of career development, unsafe working environment, no time or respect to do quality jobs, has left the recruitment and retention of qualified and experienced prison educators at crisis point. That was 2022. Nothing has changed. If anything, it has gotten worse. So I'm not suggesting we shouldn't find pockets of best practice, but they are pockets, and they have managed to, you know, manifest despite a system structured to almost guarantee they never happen. And our prison educators deserve so much better, because they perform miracles on a daily basis with people written off by the rest of society. And our prison population definitely deserve better.
Okay, thank you, Jo. And Victoria? Well, I'm in the unique position of I could offer lots of examples of best practice, because prison libraries have a much easier approach, I'd say, than education. It's not as formula as education. Example from Kent. All prison libraries, as far as I know, or almost all, have prison library orderlies, and those are people who are prisoners who are working in the library as library assistants, and they do the job of what a person in the outside library would do as a library assistant. So in Kent, we decided to try out having our library assistant in our open women's prison go and have a job in the local library. And it was fantastic. There were a few issues that we were worried about, like the staff in the local library finding out that it was a prisoner, and we said to the prisoner, you can say that you're a prisoner or you can say not. And she chose to just tell them that she worked at East Sutton Park and that she was just working there as well. And she was great. And actually what we'll do now is roll that out more extensively. We're currently recruiting the next position, because from her point of view, it gave her back her confidence. She felt like she could re-enter the workforce. And it was a really nice, easy step from being the prison library orderly to working in the public library.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Apologies to the panel for starting you late and finishing you late. Thank you very much for staying for the afternoon. It's been incredibly useful for us. We're going to end the session there. Order.